Hello everyone. Today I would like to make a quick video about recreating the boot partition on this Raspberry Pi and preparing related files in preparation for installing Linux Gentoo on this Raspberry Pi. Back on the computer, we will be using a simple copy-paste script to perform the operations. A link to this script will be provided in the video's description below. Feel free to download and follow along if you'd like. We will be creating a few archive files along the way. First of all, we have an archive file of the boot partition on the SD card, and this will just contain a copy of all the files from that partition. And then we have an archive of the kernel modules. And then we have two more archives of the firmware, and this is the firmware for specific to the hardware on the Raspberry Pi, and these firmware files are loaded when the drivers are loaded for the specific hardware. There are two different sets of firmware files. One of them is for specific to the Bluetooth hardware on the Raspberry Pi, and then we have another set of firmware files for everything else. So in order to make this easier, we have got some variables that we will set up to help out with the script, and this will also allow us to easily change things later if we need to. Let's start off by pasting the variables into the terminal window, and then we will prepare the local working directory. So after running these commands, the contents of this directory will be erased, so do be aware of that. So run these couple commands, and this will essentially wipe out and prepare that folder for us. And now we should be in that folder. We perform directory list. Okay, it is empty. Okay, now we're going to download the files required, and these are just git commands. And essentially we're going to download three things. We're going to download the Raspberry Pi firmware, and then we're going to download the non-free firmware, which is essentially where we are going to pull the firmware files from. And then we will download the Bluetooth firmware files. Let's go ahead and execute these. And also to note, this firmware download, this will actually contain an entire copy of the boot partition that we're going to be creating. But in a previous video, we created a custom firmware compile, and we'll be using that for this. Okay, next we will do the firmware files, and we will get the Bluetooth firmware files. And then just for later use, if we need them, we're going to archive these. So just run these commands, and this will create an archive file of the Git repositories that we just downloaded. Okay, the next step is we're going to recreate the boot partition for the Raspberry Pi. So we will create a folder where that will be held. If we look at our directory right now, so we created a folder called bootfs, and this is essentially where these files will be copied. And these files right here is what we just downloaded in the firmware repositories. So we will copy paste those, and that will essentially load those files into our bootfs folder. And we can take a look and we can see what's in there at the moment. And the next step is we can do, now there is a kernel, and there are kernel files in here as well, but like I said, we'll be using a custom kernel for this process. Specifically, I needed to include BTRFS support. compiled directly into the kernel, and that's not provided in the default Raspberry Pi kernel. Okay, and then, so that was the kernel 8 files. This is for the Raspberry Pi 4 and below. And then we will also put in the kernel for the Raspberry Pi 5. And we can take a look at the current folder and see what's in here. So we are still in the process. We're recreating the boot partition on the Raspberry Pi. So the next things we need to do is we need to create a command line.txt file. Now I've got the default. This is the default that was on the SD card that I created earlier, but we need to change a few things. In my case, I'm going to be using an external hard disk as the root file system during the Gentoo installation, as I don't really want to wear out the SD card with the number of writes that are going to be happening. So I'm going to change this slightly and direct the root to /dev/sda2. The root file system, I will be using a btrfs file system, and I am going to take out this quiet and splash screen. And I'm also going to add one more option here called root delay. And we're going to give it a 10-second delay. So essentially when the Raspberry Pi boots, it's going to give the external USB hard disk 10 seconds to spin up before it attempts to mount the partition. I think the rest of this is okay. Let's go ahead and copy paste that in. And then we have our config.txt file. And I just grabbed this off the Raspberry Pi SD card image that I created the other day. And we can take a look and see what's in that file. And this is just the standard config file for the Raspberry Pi. And I'm just going to leave all those default settings as is. Now we're going to create an archive of that. This finishes up the boot partition for the Raspberry Pi. So if we take a look at it again, let's see, let's put that down here. So this is essentially the contents of our new boot partition for the Raspberry Pi. So we'll go ahead and archive that off so that we can use it for the Gentoo installation later. So next we're going to create an archive of the kernel modules. These kernel modules are specific to the kernel version that they were compiled with. So we'll go ahead and create the folder. And we will extract the kernel modules. This is from these kernel the kernel and the kernel modules are actually from a video from previous day where we created those, and I will provide a link to that video in this video's description. You can take a look at that, and I will also provide these couple files, links to these files if you'd like to download these files as well. Okay, and then we're going to extract the kernel 2 modules. So kernel 1 is the kernel 8 for the Raspberry Pi 4 and below. Kernel 2 is the Raspberry 5 files. And then we can take a look at the folder and see what we have. So these are the two kernel modules folders that we extracted. And we're just going to create a simple archive of those modules. Okay, next we're going to do the firmware files. And there are quite a few, and these are coming from the firmware-nonfree repository that we copied, that we downloaded a minute ago. go ahead and create the necessary folder, and we're going to create the necessary subfolders, and we're going to copy out just the necessary files. These are also available on the Raspberry Pi SD card, the official OS SD card as well, if you'd like to pull them off there. Okay, and then what the Raspberry Pi team has done for these drivers is, it seems that many of the different types of hardware that's called different things, a lot of them use the same actual firmware files. So there are a lot of symbolic links. So we'll recreate all those symbolic links. Okay. And let's go ahead and fix the permissions on these files. And if we take a look at the two folders that we just created, so you will notice all the symbolic links here that we just created too. Looks okay. And now we're going to archive those off and save those for later. And we'll do the same thing with the Bluetooth firmware files. And then we'll archive these files off. These don't have any symbolic links to create. We will correct the permissions. And we could take a look at the two folders that we just created. And these are the files that we just copied in. And we will create an archive of these files as well. Okay, so we've just created the four things. We create an archive of the boot partition, which is in our bootfs folder, and we created an archive of the firmware for the Bluetooth and a firmware for everything else. And then we have the kernel modules. And that's pretty much it for creating these archives. And we will be using these in the Gentoo installation if you follow along with that. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for watching, and we will see you on the next one.